open up this discussion and reflecting on this year's report. I'd now like to open up the floor for any specific questions that you'd like to direct to any of the panel, or indeed a comment on this subject area from your own field of interest and expertise. And I'll take a batch of questions or comments first of all, and maybe when you speak it would be great if you could just identify who you are and your organisational affiliation, and to speak loud and clear, please. So I'll take 2 or 3, maybe starting from over there. There's one. Yep. I think there's a microphone coming.
Hi, I'm Rosina, and I just finished my master's from University College London in Environment and Sustainable Development. And so I haven't read the report yet, but I'm just wondering, like, rather than talk and focus on food security, it seems to make more sense to talk about food sovereignty, just because I feel food security is a much more simplistic way of just talking about ensuring people get enough to eat, whereas the other framework, I think, addresses issues of like where the food comes from, power structure, sustainability, even like quality, which I think leads to the question of nutrition. So I'm just wondering if maybe it's the framework that needs to be reexamined.
Okay, thank you. There's one here.
Thanks, Rob Bailey from Chatham House. But before that, I worked at Oxfam, and about this time last year I was in the Sahel working on the food crisis there. And one of the things at this stage in the response that we were doing was talking to donors, to international organisations, to the affected governments about the need to start transitioning from a short-term response to asset recovery and then into longer-term development to increase resilience and so on. And I've heard a bit about livelihoods and resilience and long-term development in what we've been talking about today. And with a lot of the coverage I've seen of the East African crisis, I think I've detected more about that part of the debate. So there's been these emergency summits in Rome with the FAO looking at the need for long-term development and so on, and the World Bank's announced a pot of money for long-term agricultural development in the region. And I'm wondering, first of all, whether the panel senses there is a bit of a shift in the international system towards these issues, whether or not the international system can actually organise itself out of short-term and long-term silos so that it can deliver this effectively. And then finally, what the hell do you do with this agenda in the case of a country like Somalia, where long-term development and agricultural development is going to be incredibly complicated to deliver?
Okay, thank you. I'll take 2 more questions here, and then we'll have a response to those, and then I'll come to the other side of the room and also reflect some interesting questions from online as well. So 2 questions here.
Hi, Polly Walker from World Vision UK. I'm not terribly familiar with the funding mechanisms, but I think that both Simon and Mary identified this the problem with the early warning systems. I think Somalia has really highlighted for everyone how early warning system seems to work, but the problem is that they're not linked to effective and rapid funding strategies. And I think that we would respond if those funds were made quickly available. The tsunami saw a huge excess of funds raised. Somalia has seen a real shortage because it's very media dependent. It depends on what the public is interested to respond to. So could in the UK the DEC and other strategies be linked to slush funds for early mitigation activities more effectively?
Okay, one more at the front here.
I've got a slightly different question about
Please do.
Following themes. David Jones, I'm the immediate past president of the International Federation of Social Workers, and my question relates to the response on the ground, and it's particularly the sector that I come from. Social work is differently developed in different places, but in many places there are at least some social workers on the ground, and social workers are often, but not always, integrated with the sort of humanitarian responses to disasters. And it's something that internationally we are thinking about, how that should be strengthened, how training for on-the-ground professionals should be improved to enable disaster responses, and ways that social workers, along with a range of other professionals who are on the ground in contact with communities there already, how they can be engaged with some of these processes, rather than what I hear happens very often, people coming in from outside with grand designs, plans to change things, sometimes walking over the local professionals, some of whom, of course, caught up in the disaster themselves, so may well be disabled in some sense by that. So I suppose the question is, has there been any thinking about the connections with existing groups that might be able to provide some response? How can that be better anticipated? And particularly, is there ways of training for local professionals that we can explore together to improve the response on the ground?
Okay, thank you very much for that round of good questions to open up the discussion. I'm going to try and group a couple of these together and ask colleagues on the panel to comment. Maybe Fred, kicking off at the sort of the very big picture around the question about how suitable and workable is the global food security as a framework, or should we be talking more about global food sovereignty? And then to sort of tag on to that, something related to if you like, to the more macro picture, a question that's coming from Plan International colleague in London around food price spikes, where he poses the question around the role of speculators and traders of derivatives. How damaging is their role, and what can and needs to be done in terms of tackling that? And then maybe we'll, after that, come to Mary and Simon to comment particularly around the humanitarian response and the shift from the short term to the long term, and some of these themes around the funding architecture. So briefly, Fred, on the bigger picture.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of food security issue depends. It kind of comes back to the dichotomy I was talking about earlier, whether you think it's a matter of volume of food or not. I'm not an academic, so I'm not a great one for sort of for conceptual frameworks. I tend to sort of shoot a bit more from the hip. But I mean, I think I have a sense that food sovereignty is a more useful context in which to think about these things, because I don't think food is such a global commodity that as long as it's there somewhere, it will get to the people who need it. But food sovereignty is about, as you say, about power. It's not necessarily about food sovereignty at the national level. It may be about food sovereignty at a very local level, if you're going to ensure food security. I think on this business of food price spikes, I mean, I think there's an interesting debate and an unresolved debate really going on about what has caused the great volatility in food prices in the last few years. I mean, there's sort of three layers to it, I think, one of which is the sort of really long-term trends about whether we're producing enough food and whether the market systems can deliver food, as I say, over a long period, or whether we're kind of coming up against limits to growth or anything of that sort. And then there's a sort of medium level where you have sort of year-on-year fluctuations of supply and demand, whether you get a drought somewhere. We have the great sort of biofuels boom, taking grain out of the food supply system and putting it into the energy system. And both those two elements are obviously relevant to prices. But then there's the question of whether market forces, possibly very short-term market forces, have a big effect. And there are two things that are discussed there, one of which is that countries that feel under pressure to, especially once food prices start to rise, they stop exporting in order to protect food supplies for their own country. And certainly in 2008 and in 2010 in Russia, in 2008 in India and elsewhere, embargoes on food exports, we seem to exacerbate food supply problems and therefore begin to push up prices. And then perhaps the element of speculators, which some people think is very important and some people think is not important. I think it would be not surprising if speculators got on the bandwagon and began to amplify these problems, and especially when you get complex derivatives and index funds, the sort of Goldman Sachs kind of approach to globalizing and marketizing food. I think most people in most economists and most sort of finance people and people in markets would expect that would increase price volatility, which, you know, prices go up as well as down, but would increase price volatility. So I think it would be very surprising if speculators didn't have an effect. But there are these different layers, and I think, there's probably rather a lot more academic work to be done before we decide exactly who's responsible for which. But I certainly don't think we should discount speculators, especially in the short term.
Okay, thanks. Simon, there was a question from our colleague Rob from Chatham House around this shift or apparent shift towards more resilience, longer term strategies. Do you think that that reflects a significant change of tact in the international system and how we're dealing with drought and crises on a longer term approach rather than the short termism?
Don't think we've seen that yet on the ground. I think some of the discourse, some of the jargon has changed. There's a lot more talk. I mean, the word resilience is big. It is everywhere. Donors are talking about it in particular. So I think that there is hope that there may be, and I think also that donors are more and more aware, especially humanitarian donors, are more and more aware of the limitations and the problems which short-term funding has when they know. Someone in the room will know the figure better than I do. It's something like 80 or 90% of humanitarian expenditure goes on protracted crises, ones which have been going on for, year after year after year, and yet they're still dealt with on 6 months, 12-month cycles. Donors are much more aware of that of a problem. There is a lot more of the discourse around resilience and prevention and the need for long-term development. Whether we've seen that yet on the ground, small initiatives, people feeling their way towards it. But I think that I'm not yet convinced that the full implications of the shift have been taken on board and that we know how to deal with them. Personally, I think it's a lot more fundamental than just kind of changing how many months you can get money for. And I'm not quite sure that we've got it quite right, or that we're even beginning to tackle the problems. I mean, for example, there was a question on slush funds, which I can, if I can link that. Is it just that, early warning didn't trigger early response? Is it just the funding? No, it's not just the funding. It really, really isn't. And you've got to partly ask the question: why are donors not releasing the money quick enough? And part of the problem is the agencies who are doing response. Is that they're not analysing in a long-term way, they are not strategizing in a long-term, coordinated and coherent way, and they are not advocating to the donors, saying, look, here's the position, here's where we're going, here's where we'll be in 12 months' time, 2 years. This is the overall strategy. Now, can we talk about it? And when we've had that discussion, then, well, can I have some money for this, maybe? But the only conversation between people asking for money and those giving the money is around the money. I had that. That was kind of starkly said to me by the head of one of the main donors in Nairobi, who said, it's funny, no NGO ever comes to speak to me except to ask for money. They never come to talk about, and they will always claim we're the people on the ground, we know what's going on. Then how come you're not sitting in the offices whether it's Nairobi or wherever else, or London and so on, talking to the donors, strategizing, saying what's coming up? So I think there's a lot more. It isn't just about the money. Hopefully, this crisis, because I think enough people have been calling the shot, saying it's recurrent, we got it wrong again and again and again and again. I think that penny has to a large extent dropped in many places. So I think there is a possibility if we all kind of sing together loudly enough, and put our shoulders to the wheel, we might get some movement on it.
Okay, thank you. Mary, a brief comment from you on the challenging context of Somalia. You talked about the Horn response of the Red Cross, but clearly Somalia presents a huge challenge in taking a longer-term resilience agenda. What would be your perspective on how all of this translates into a context as challenging as Somalia?
That's a very difficult question to answer, actually, because Somalia is incredibly complex. I don't have any particular viewpoints on that in terms of forwarding that agenda. I mean, if I could, I just wanted to respond to the person who mentioned food sovereignty, to say yes. I mean, personally, I think it's a very important issue, and perhaps the food security framework as such could put more emphasis on sustainability and sustainable diets and environmental issues as well. So just to make that comment, and also in terms of the question on the speculation, that is addressed in the report, and that chapter was written by Fred Musso, whose point really was that that the speculation issue means that the markets are no longer properly reflecting supply and demand, and that when there is a problem like a drought, then the price fluctuations become accentuated because of the speculators' involvement with it. And his sort of how he's sort of said the way forward is for better transparency, so can actually see who are the players within the market, and also better state regulation. So that's basically giving the response that's in the report.
I've had 3 questions that have come from very important influential places such as Rome, New York and Geneva, and they're or maybe we trust are influential places on this subject area. They are all of the same theme, and I'd like to sort of throw that back to the audience here, because I think there'd be a lot of expertise or experience on this particular theme around social protection and use of cash-based responses. And just to give a flavour of these questions, in what way is social protection thought to be an instrument of response to food security and especially malnutrition? How is it supposed to tackle malnutrition? Another question, very similar, the question from New York was, in the Horn, Oxfam and other partners have had a long-term social protection cash-based scheme. How's that played out now? And then there were similar questions, as I said, from Geneva. If I was to sort of play that back to colleagues here, what is the view? A lot of the thinking and agency focus has been around social protection and the use of cash-based transfers. How critical, we didn't really touch on that in the panel discussions, but it is an important theme in the report. Is there a comment or a view in the room on that? Maybe I'll back that to Mary, because I know that there's...
I think Simon wants
Well,
to.
you get after you. Ladies first.
Well, I think social protection has an important role to play, definitely, together with supporting small-scale farmers. One of the issues, again, highlighted in this report are the problems associated with safety net programs, like the existing one in Ethiopia, the PSMP, which provides cash or food. But to I think 8 million people in Ethiopia on a annual basis. One of the issues that's come up with the safety nets is around the food price inflation. So in Ethiopia, the food prices, I think in 2008, went up 300%. So that had a lot of implications for those receiving cash transfers. And the system was only able to increase those by 33%. So there are some issues there, and they're incredibly important, but there are a lot of other things that have to happen as well to address the underlying issues, and also to help people strengthen their livelihood and progress on from being within the safety nets.
Okay. Simon, you were going to comment, and then I'll open up the floor this side.
Very briefly, first of all, social protection, big on the agenda, and rightly so. Sadly, social protection too often is equated with cash transfers. Now that is the form in which a particular form of social protection happens in countries like here, pensions, child benefit, and so on and so forth. But to suggest, trying to limit the way in which communities, countries, populations look after the people who can't look after themselves, and to reduce that to state handing you a pile of money, I think is a shame. I mean, for example, to get back to the theme I promised not to talk about, protection of land rights for women and things like that, and for widows, that should be part of the social protection agenda as well. So I would want to make sure that social protection doesn't become equated with cash. On the nutrition side, we've actually just done a study, which is in first draft at the moment. A colleague of mine has led on that, looking at is there any evidence that cash in humanitarian disasters has any nutritional impacts? And one thing that was done was to look at the literature of cash transfers in social protection, and unsurprisingly, probably the answer is we've no idea. And partly for good reasons. There are always so many things going on and so many different variables that to try and sort this one out statistically, even where people have looked for the evidence, which is very, very rarely, we still don't know. So can social protection, cash transfers deliver on nutrition? It's hard to know. And in some ways that's a good thing, because if you give, one of the reasons to give people money is to let them, is to allow, is to give them agency, if you want. Let them decide what's the most important thing in their own lives. And short-term nutrition of their kids should be one of their priorities. It's not necessarily their only one. And if we kind of try to make sure, well, I want to give you choice, but I want to make sure you choose what I think you should choose, there's a certain, has anyone noticed there's a slight contradiction there? So the idea of kind of how do I give a cash transfer that will maximize the nutritional output? I mean, you can see where that's coming from, isn't it? Because it is about the kid. Yeah, but, so I'll leave it on that one.
Okay, thank you. Question here, and then Ed, and one more colleague at the back.
Ian Bust, formerly DFID, now Plan UK and Interact Worldwide. When we had the last food price spike, there was research presented here from West Africa which showed that in fact the local prices and so forth in that was West African countries were determined almost entirely by local production and not at all by what came in the way or out of the way by import prices, just to remind everybody about that. The second point which relates to this is I do hope, and this is the resilience point I'm going to, I do hope that in future disasters, emergency committee members and others, and Plan is now one of those, will couch their appeals in terms not just of dealing with the immediate problem, but how to prevent it coming up in future. And that way we will get a linkage. But the important warning, do not let us do it in places where it will not be politically sustainable. And if you create new Somali towns in northeast Kenya, I have a nasty feeling that that is going to be extremely unpopular with the Kenya government and cause considerable friction and problems later on.
Thank you. Ed Clay. I've had the good fortune to at least skim-read the report before the session, so I'm at an advantage against most of the audience. I think Fred touched on an important point when he contrasted the Beddington and the Bob Watson views, because actually this report, we should be very clear, wouldn't be uncontroversial. If we were to think about the current global financial confusion, or if we were to think about the analyses of the global food spike in 2007-8, or indeed the one which occurred last year and running into this year, there isn't any consensus. What you have, for example, within the economics community, you've got two groups of people with very strongly held, very convinced views about how things are, and they do not very easily come together. So, for example, on the speculation issue, there's a very, very widespread and very strongly held view amongst many economists that actually financial speculation has really a minimal role in global price volatility. On the other side, and Fred's contribution to this report reflects, there's another very strongly held view that actually it's very important. I think I probably belong in that group myself. I'll illustrate. I mean, this morning, just out of interest, I looked at a trade website on the rice market, and they were speculating what the consequences were of the Federal Reserve's intention to move into quantitative easing, what it would have on commodity prices. Now, this is not academic. These are the traders themselves. So one has to say the financialization of global commodity markets is one of the important things we have to think about, and its implications for what the humanitarian community does do, number one. The second thing, and I think the food sovereignty issue, it's worth bearing in mind that when food security as an issue rose, it was about national food security. It was about how governments could ensure that they had the food to enable them to provide minimum requirements of their own populations. The discussion moved away from that towards individual food security. But if we look at, again, figure 1.1 of the report, you'll see 60% of the world's undernourished people are in Asia. And that means Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, China, and other to a lesser extent. 3 of those countries are members of the G20, India, Indonesia, and China. which then brings one back to a next part of this. There's a very good chapter by Dan Maxwell about the humanitarian system and what you can do and how it's improving within an assumed existing context. The question is that context itself changing very rapidly and going to be very different in the immediate future? Which brings one back to something which I think ought to be introduced into the discussion, which is what actually is the international system we're talking about. That, I think, is something which the report doesn't really address. It talks about governments, donors, and civil society. But if we think back to the G20, and as I said, what we're in now is a global situation where a small number of countries not only include most of the world's undernourished people, they are also very powerful actors in the global food system. So I think one of the things we have to think about and begin to introduce into our discussion, and others have talked about this, if you like, what is indeed going to be the political framework within which one considers humanitarian action over the coming decade? I think that's something. So what I would say, one of the things that would be interesting to do would be to look at, let's say, the relationship between the discussions here in civil society and, for example, the G20. It's very interesting if you look at the plan of action of the G20, which you'll find on the French government's Agriculture Ministry website. They say in the lead up to their plan of action, they talked to, of course, themselves. They talked to producer groups globally. They talked to the Global Economic Forum, and the French government itself consulted with some NGOs. So what one's asking here, I think, is in a sense, who are the we, which has come up in the discussion? Who is the we? Who is the international community? Who are those who have agency in this international system, and how does that agency influence what's going on? I think it's a very difficult area, and I'd end by just drawing attention to, I contributed a box at the end of the report about food aid negotiations. If you look at the difficulty that even just the Western group of donors have in moving forwards in trying to adapt themselves, trying to find some better way of doing things, one realised that there is really a very challenging global agenda. And so the question is, how does this kind of discussion integrate into, is it going to influence, or is it going to have, as if you like in Dan Maxwell's chapter, in a sense, take that changing context as where it works, where it does its humanitarian activity, where its humanitarian space is.
Thank you. Pass the microphone behind you. There are two more comments.
Hi, I'm Jo Kanmaung, Policy Advisor on Food Security at Tear Fund. Thanks for mentioning building resilience and the need to take preventative action. And we've seen in East Africa last November, there was a warning from the UN and they appealed for $500 million. And if that money had been raised, that would have prevented the situation from deteriorating. And now we face a situation where the humanitarian aid has soared to $2.5 billion. And for years, Tear Fund has been lobbying policymakers to integrate building resilience and risk reduction into development. And DFID has made some progress, and now they've committed to increasing resilience into all their country strategies. But many other donors are behind that. And Tear Fund produced a report this year on Malawi on the economic benefits of investing in agriculture and reducing the risk to drought. So in one project, for every £1 invested, there were benefits of £24 in return. So farmers were more food secure, they had a nutritious diet, they had extra income to spend on contingencies, and they felt more confident that they could deal with a drought. So in terms of the report, does that mention the economic benefits of taking preventative action and investing in agriculture?
Hi, my name's Adelaine Williams. I'm from De Montfort University, and I think the lady in front of me might have just answered my question. My question's on accountability. With the new results agenda, how do we measure success in resilience, mitigation, preparedness? We knew about the possibility of a famine a year ago, so actually stability in nutrition levels would have been a huge, major outcome. How can we prove that a programme has been successful just because we've diverted what might have been? I'm kind of worried that with the new results agenda, that mitigation preparedness might be ignored because the impact is harder to prove.
And one question here, and then Suzanne, and then I'd like to just contribute 2 comments, one from India and one from Pakistan.
A quick question. I'm Stephen Biggs, retired from the University of East Anglia. The excessive corporate power in the global food system mentioned in several chapters of this report is regularly discussed in NGO and academic circles, but remains virtually taboo amongst donors. That seems to be quite a challenge in this report. And I'd like to ask the question of the sponsors of the report. What are your plans now? Does this signal a change or of strategy as regards your future activities?
Thank you. Susan.
Thank you. Suzanne Jaspers, Bristol University. There's so many issues I want to talk about, but I guess one of the main things one of the things that Simon highlighted was this return to the kind of the global dimension, looking at kind of world economy, trade, land grabbing, and I think this is very welcome. I mean, I wanted to ask the panel whether they think this is a new trend, this is actually something recent, and because in my current work, I've been taking very much a historical approach. And I remembered when I did my master's in nutrition way back in the 80s, this is what we used to look at. We looked at, especially in social nutrition, issues of global inequality, political economy of hunger, about issues of global justice. And I get the sense that this has kind of disappeared for a while. We focused on people's kind of coping strategies or community-based kind of livelihood, community livelihoods. So is this, do the panel think this is a real trend? Are we kind of coming back to looking at issues of global inequality? Or have I just missed it in the last 20 years? I guess my next question is more about kind of resilience in relation to this issues of inequality and global inequality. I mean, I think some people have suggested that resilience, a focus on resilience, actually has the opposite trend. You're focusing much more down at kind of individuals and how to adapt to inevitable problems. So just making life possible rather than actually making it better. And finally, I guess what I'm thinking is, since the humanitarian community and development community have had about kind of 40, 50 years to practice now. I mean, how can we expect people to trust what we're, us at all in our development and humanitarian interventions? This is people in developing countries, I guess.
Thank you, Suzanne. I will just read out 2 comments, as I said, and then I'll ask the panel to respond to some of the, the very pertinent and challenging comments and some questions as well from the floor. Bhavjoy Ban, who's a researcher in Chennai, India, comments, the policies of globalization and liberalization have seen public investment in agriculture fall from the decade of the 1990s in many countries, including India. Given the majority of the population in these countries is dependent on agriculture, unless countries' food and nutrition security is made a national priority, there can be no effective solutions. Dr. Hina, who's self-employed from Pakistan, comments, in Pakistan, I've seen very closely the humanitarian response is mainly focused on providing shelter and provision of food packages. No one focuses on resilience. And while keeping in view the disasters like flood and earthquakes, when is the best time to focus on development of resilience among people so that they could themselves, with motivation, help themselves? Simon.
Oh, well, thanks. Okay, so time. Couple of quick points. One, it's very easy to kind of say it's all the speculators, it's the global economic order, it's the World Trade, and so on and so forth. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that I don't agree with that view. Question: what are we going to do about it? Humanitarian NGOs are going to overturn the World Trade Organization. I don't know. And that was someone raised this point. Whoever it was, I'm not sure. It doesn't matter. It was yes. So the donors on the kind of one part of government being a humanitarian donor, but buys in and funds this and will happily agree with it, and the other 99.9% of government is actually sitting at the talks and stitching up the poor to keep themselves rich. And when are we going to make them aware of the fact that actually they're causing a problem and then trying to give themselves a huge amount of praise for promising one day to put back 0.7% of it? I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think that it's so easy for us to sloganise, and it's very comforting for us to sloganise and to pretend that the problem is so big you can't expect me to actually change it, so I'll take comfort in crying about it. And I really don't mean this in a negative or cynical way. I don't know what I think. We have to find a way of engaging with this again. And I know it has been done in the past, and the NGOs have campaigned very much on fair trade and so on. I sense that kind of slipped a little bit, and maybe we need to a new focus on it and to tie it up, to join up some of the dots. Resilience. There is a danger. I mean, I think that the new focus on resilience is wonderful, potentially wonderful. It's at the moment words, but it's also a little bit. There are always dangers in anything. And one of the dangers of the resilience agenda, I think it was Suzanne who said it, is it's going to be too easily turned into, oh, we're going to teach you how to help yourselves. Well, hold on a minute. Who said that those people are to blame for their poverty in the first place? If the causes of poverty are not in the village and in the household, why do we assume that that they should have the solution in their own hands? So I think the idea of resilience, of analysing very much at that family level, well, what is causing these people to be so vulnerable to repeated disasters? Now, where does the solution lie? It might well not lie in this capacity building, training, participatory, and all the rest of it, because actually, we did move that way. I think you're right. Kind of, the 80s was more political. 70s, 80s was the word political economy was used sort of 30 years ago, and then kind of disappeared from fashion and is now back in again. Meaning something slightly different, but okay, at least it's there. But too easily, I want to be nice to people, so I'll work with you directly, and that actually implicitly is saying that you're to blame for your own problems, because if the solution is in your hands, then the fact that you haven't used them yet is in a way, it's an individual blame rather than a system blame approach. So my worry is that resilience is going to go down that road, and I really, really hope it doesn't. Do we deserve to be trusted? Wow. I repeat the question. I have no. Well, actually, I think the simple answer is we're not. Anyone who's worked in humanitarian response and development knows very, very well that the people who we work with don't trust our solutions. They will get out of us whatever they can. And that's something that we actually need to understand, not to blame them for it, not to say they're right or they're wrong, because that's actually neither here nor there. But until we actually appreciate that people don't trust us and fit into the way we design a program, they've got their own lives, which they're trying to sort out as well or as badly as they can, and they will use whatever is around as well or as badly as they can, and they make us fit into their lives. Until we actually realise that and have a little bit less hubris and a little bit less of this kind of, I did this so they will do that. Oh no, they won't. They'll do whatever they want to do with the opportunity you give them. And they don't trust us. And there's no reason why they should, and I don't think it either matters or doesn't matter. The question is, are they able to use us constructively in ways that help? I think really that's the way we ought to think about it.
Okay, yes. Have we forgotten about global inequality? Yes, I think so. I think for many years people assumed that the market would somehow deliver, or that was the sort of dominant discourse. It might be a bit bumpy along the way, but at the end of the day, the market will deliver. But I think people are growing increasingly and rather obviously cynical about that approach. So I think that is a long-term trend. I think probably we've come out of that period and we're heading off in a different territory. And I think that ties up with the concerns about the sort of marketization and globalization of food. I think there are real dangers about food becoming, if you like, just another commodity. If it is going to become just like another commodity, we're going to see much more volatile food prices around the world than we've hitherto seen, and there are real dangers about that. And one of my disappointments with the Beddington report in particular was that its sort of bland assumption that more marketization of food was an unalloyed good thing, and that there was really no evidence of a downside of it. I think there are very large evidence of very large downsides. I was very struck by your remark about West Africa, which is perhaps less plugged into the globalized market system for food than many parts of the world. There are more internal markets and so on, and how that insulated it from the huge price spikes. I think that's quite a revealing point. Whereas countries much more open to the market have had really big problems, whether you're talking about Mexico or, perhaps I'll finish on this, parts of the Arab world. We talk here over the Arab Spring. Our media was talking a lot about, justifiably, about how they were protesting about corruption and bad government and so on. Quite a lot of them were protesting about food prices, which had doubled and tripled and so on around the time that the demonstrations were going on. So this is a highly political issue. And as I say, the commoditization, globalization of food markets, I think is very, very dangerous.
Wow, what a lot of questions. And I was just thinking, if I was sitting in the audience, I'd probably be asking quite a lot of the same questions. So a bit overwhelmed with all the questions. I don't have necessarily any answers to them, like anyone else. So I'll just respond to a few points. Longer term, investing more in longer term, yes. I mean, the problem is, it's not very sexy. It's not very newsworthy. So I think we're all struggling with the same question about how to raise more money for longer term. Resilience activities on the back of disasters. And with the West Africa market issue, I didn't go to that presentation, but from my understanding, I think West African countries were hit by the high food prices in relation to rice. Right. Yeah, because they're very dependent upon rice coming in from Thailand, I think, in places who actually, I've forgotten the details, but some countries actually stopped exporting rice to protect their own rice consumption, and this impacted very badly on these countries in West Africa who used to grow their own rice, but through lack of investment in agriculture are no longer able, were no longer able to provide their own market demand for it. Yes, investment in agriculture critical, and that just proves the point. And I think that does make in the report it makes reference to investments in agriculture having a really big impact on poor people and small farmers, particularly if it is focused on supporting small farmer practices as opposed to industrialised farming methods. Role of humanitarian sector. Well, I mean, we can't solve hunger. We have an important role to play, but we do have limitations. We can. I think for me personally, I think we have an important role in communicating the messages around how hunger impacts on so many people in the world. There's a very important role there, and in trying to address some of these problems, and also to engage in policy around these problems. But we are limited, and really I think the report is saying right at the beginning that what is needed is a change in paradigm change in the way that we produce food and distribute food. It's a global issue. It's not just around the international humanitarian sector. It's actually all of us here. The way that we get food, we need to have sustainable diets. I mean, if we all ate like Britain, apparently we'd need 3 globes to feed the whole world. If we all ate like America, we'd need 5 globes to feed us. So there's some really big issues here, and we really need to think about those issues. And we have many futures reports about the issue. I think there's a lot of consensus. The issue is the how, and actually doing something about it, and having that political will and the resources as well to do it. So very big questions, and our role within that as well is perhaps a lot of questions relating to that too.
Thank you, Mary. We have run out of time, and in many ways we've just scratched the surface of some very huge questions but important issues. Maybe just I should comment, representing the organisation that is the sponsor of this report, and that very challenging question: what does that mean for us? And why would we commission a report on this subject? I think, if I'm very honest, we, dealing day to day in the world of humanitarian response, have grappled with the longer term challenges around chronic crises, and I think we are seeing a shift within our own world of the Red Cross, but indeed amongst other humanitarian response organisations here, towards more of a resilience agenda. Our focus is particularly at the community level, trying to work with most vulnerable communities to strengthen their resilience to cope with the stresses and shocks caused by crises, particularly challenging for us are food security crises. And I think, as Mary said, we can't approach that in isolation of wider actors, and it's one area that really does need a more joined up approach between humanitarian and development community. Our structures, our budgets, and our system doesn't always enable that, but we've got to have a much more joined up approach. I'm not going to attempt to sum up in 60 seconds what has been a very rich discussion. I would simply say I'd really encourage you to read the report, which I think poses some of the critical questions on this subject for today. It does offer areas of potential. Fred highlighted the critical role of small holdings and farmers, the importance of social protection, the opportunities to take more of a risk reduction, resilience approach as needing to be much more of a priority for humanitarian action, as well as the big issues around the global food system. This is indeed, it's a global issue. It's not just a humanitarian or development issue, but I hope that we all, from our various corners as policymakers, academics, researchers, students, and whatever organisation we work with, or indeed independently, can contribute to what surely is an absolute critical issue and challenge for the world today. And I know all of you share that concern towards seeing a world which is more food secure, and that particularly the most vulnerable have that access to that global food security that is so central to people's lives and well-being. So thank you for your interest. Thank you, colleagues in Rome, New York, Pakistan, India and beyond who contributed, and thank you to the panel for your contributions today.